Well, Cathi, welcome to Basis 30, I think it is.
Okay, hi.
And we've decided to bring all your work together. Your original interview, which was slated as a Basis educational thing, but was also with the Amash project, which we're no longer with. But and your brilliant presentation at the Amash conference in, I think it's September 2012. You did an outstanding job, and we're very, very fortunate to have you here in a crop circle, freshly made today, between Silbury Hill and West Kennet Long Barrow, in the cloudy afternoon in mid-August 2013. You've done some more research, and your research is continuing and being tremendous.
Well, thanks. Yeah. Well, since the presentation, which I think was my last contact with you in that respect, have a couple of interesting developments really about people who've contacted me or who I've contacted. First of all, there's been a contact from somebody, a therapist who's working with a client from Swainswick who's been having recollections of satanic ritual abuse in that village. Going back, she's been having these for about 15 years, and they contacted me, which was quite, exciting to get some corroboration of that sort of activity, which I was hoping to chat. Because, of course, all my research has been historic research into mind control. And the reason it's been historic is because I've literally been basing it on looking at my own circumstances, and then anything that's come out of that, I've investigated. And in effect, that's led me to the heart of MK Ultra type of experimentation in the UK. But really going back to the 50s, I haven't really done a lot of modern stuff yet.
Your work, this is examining the UK's horrendous mind control crimes, and you're doing this. But some of your work was used by a late, close colleague, friend, researcher who passed away.
Oh, that's right. That was another interesting contact. In the course of my research, I came across some articles which were signed by Mr. T. Stokes of London, which extended the research that I'd done into some figures from that my parents had said were involved with my family, that being a Lord Moran and Lord Morrison, Herbert Morrison, and I noticed some articles by him that included research on those people, so I contacted him with my side of the story or what I'd found out. And now he was called Mr. T. Stokes, and he has actually died since I was corresponding with him in February. I found out recently that he died. I think he was certainly an elderly gentleman, possibly in his 90s. The obituary I read said 93. However, he seemed to be much, much younger. When I corresponded with him, I was quite surprised to find out he was that age. But he was an extraordinary person who'd been a whistleblower for many, many years. Now, he was interviewed on Red Ice Radio in 2008, which is a great interview. And he talked specifically about the UK. And being a man with quite some experience of the occult nature himself, in that he was a well-known palmist, palm reader, he did have a very open mind. He's corroborated my research and extended it in some ways. He's identified that now the village I grew up in, the Swainswick, is the village that I grew up in, and it was owned by Oriel College, Oxford. And he's, in one of his articles published this year, he's described how, although there were LSD experiments done at Portendown, that there were even more experiments done with twins on the subject of mind control. And he said that the documents or the documentation for these experiments is kept at Oriel College, Oxford. So that tied in because the village of Swanswick that I lived in was owned by Oriel College, Oxford. So that was quite exciting to correspond with him. Well, basically, I came to believe that something of this nature had happened to me just after seeing James Caspil's interview and the Super Soldiers interview. I had also alarm bells going off, but of course I'm 20 years older than James Caspil, so that's going back further. It's a different scenario. And so then I began investigating my background, and a couple of names that my parents said had links with the family led me straight into the MK Ultra. Some of how MK Ultra was implemented here. Yeah, being a twin was the Mr. Stokes described that the experiments were done on twins at Porton Down. Also, the village of Swanswick had associations with the Cambridge Five, or the Cambridge spy scandal, and Mr. Stokes also
the Cambridge Five being whom?
The Cambridge Five were a bunch of guys that were working for the intelligence services at quite a high level, who included Anthony Blunt, who was the godson of the Queen Mother, I think, or cousin of.
We are knitting very carefully here. Very high levels of society in this mind control thing.
Yes, well, I think we kind of intuit that we do know about high levels and paedophilia and mind control, and yet we have to find evidence. So it's quite exciting that I am uncovering some of the links, and maybe it will help. Well, it was Mr. Stokes who said that Stephen Ward was very much tied up with MK Ultra. So the people that he was in contact with, Mr. Ward, well, he ended up dead after the Profumo affair. But he was.
So, could you describe what the Profumo affair was all about?
Well, I'm kind of a bit sketchy on it, but I do know it involved the entrapment of perhaps political figures using honey trap or femme fatale figures. Christine Keeler, yeah.
The five that you mentioned, you were talking Kim Philby and all that?
Philby, Blunt, McLean, Burgess, and I can't remember who the fifth man was now. Yeah, but they...
we're talking Russian spies from Cambridge.
That's right, who were recruited when they were at Cambridge, and they carried on, they got top jobs in the intelligence, the military intelligence. And
but you're saying there's a deeper connection here than just intelligence?
Well, clearly... well, I'm saying that there could be a connection with the MK Ultra. It seems to be that people's sexuality was sometimes they were encouraged to perform sexual acts that they were then had to cover up, that they couldn't discuss, so they became blackmailable.
Yeah, but you're talking a ritual form of homosexual, paedophilic type of...
Well, no, Mr. Stokes said that... He said, number one, that Stephen Wood was a master occultist, and Mr. Stokes would know, I would say. He also said that that Winston Churchill was also very much into the occult and satanic ritual abuse. That's Winston Churchill, but then later on...
many people.
Yeah, I do suggest that you read his articles because he does go into a lot more detail about it. Now, I'd come to Winston Churchill through Lord Moran because my family mentioned a connection with Lady Moran. So And
we refer to the earlier video that we have done for details on that.
So I found the link that Lord Moran was a mentor of William Sargent, the doctor, one of the MK Ultra doctors based in England. So it's all tying back to my research and adding little bits in there. And again, as I say, people contacting me. I've had somebody else contacting me from Bath in Somerset. which is where Swainswick is situated, again with tales of satanic ritual abuse. So once I interview these people and talk to them, I will publish that further research. Another thing that's come up that I haven't covered yet was, I'm not sure that I've covered yet, was that when MK Ultra was, some of the doctors involved in MK Ultra went on to create entries in the DCM index, which lists all mental illnesses. They actually created illnesses. This is Robert Duncan that said this, that they actually created illnesses that would mean that if someone came forward talking about having been manipulated by the doctors, their symptoms would correspond with something in the index, and they could immediately be medicated or taken into psychiatric care.
You're talking about false memory syndrome.
Well, that was the other thing, is that they also created a false memory syndrome foundation, whereby they created a condition that said that if you come forward with recollections of abuse, they can turn around and say, well, you've got this condition, it's called false memory syndrome, therefore it didn't happen. And the MKL...
So the medical profession would see this and immediately assume you're nuts, and
That's right.
they just carry on procedurally. So they rigged the system.
That's right. They've rigged the system
to actually to ensure that there was continued covering up of mind control. Ultimately, what's the purpose of this?
Very well put. And the fact is that in England there is also a false memory association, and the person who's one of the founder members was married to a chap called Peter Parker, who became the director of my father's work when we were in Swainswick. He became director of the company the year after we left, so he was very closely associated with MK Ultra because his wife was a founder member of the False Memory Association.
So there's a network where companies are sort of pre-selected for who's going to take control of them?
Well, I'd just say that because Peter Parker was also an associate of Jimmy Savile, close associate, and he was also a very close associate of Prince Philip, I would say we're seeing again people at a very high level who've been implicated in paedophilia and satanic ritual abuse, again being involved with my case. So it's just giving me lots more confirmation that I really have stumbled upon something there. Again, I always sort of think at this point, perhaps to retrieve some memories of these events would be really useful, and that is in fact going to happen now because a person who wishes to remain anonymous has come forward with a substantial donation to enable me to have some sort of memory retrieval sessions. I haven't decided yet because I'm very, very wary about this. I want to make sure that it's done,
You don't have your memories permanently wiped.
Or implanted, yes, wiped or implanted. And also there can be booby traps if someone's had the full sort of MK Ultra mind control slave treatment. They can input booby traps so that you self-terminate. That's another danger. So it has to be somebody really who's aware of those dangers.
Aware of that must have been in the program.
Not necessarily. Few and far between. But there's a doctor in America called Dr. Colin Ross who's fully. It's actually people who are experts in dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder that tend to have the background knowledge. But there will be, I think I will be able to find somebody who can help. It might not even involve hypnosis, perhaps deep relaxation. And so that remains to be seen, so looking forward to that.
A little bit of deep relaxation.
Yeah. Because I do feel from the experiences I've had that there was some kind of you see, I never used the term super soldiers previously because I always associated it with actual people going into the field as fighters, in warfare situations. But if you extend that to include people who've had enhancements and manipulation, then I would say that my programming involved some beta programming for sure, because I then was taken into working in those.
Beta programming.
That's the sexuality, using the person and their sexuality to achieve particular ends.
Right, where were we? We're on beta programming.
Oh yes.
What does that involve? It's sensitive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have got an alter that's been programmed in that way, who's actually worked, who has its own identity and everything, which I'm not going to actually give the name of because I'm trying to sort of completely disassociate from that. But however, I do feel that there were enhancement programs run on us, at least on myself. I don't know. I'm not sure about my sister and various.
Your sister were involved with this?
Yeah. Now my sister is married to.
We're not talking about your twin.
This is my twin. Yeah.
Oh, right. She's
married to someone who's related to Sir John Cockcroft, who was the first person to split the atom in the UK, who worked at Harwell Laboratories. Where we know
related to all the relevant
genetic research as well as nuclear stuff. Well, there's the rain.
Well, the rain's come,
okay.
And we've got to do something to do this. So I don't know what we're going to do.
So I don't know. I don't think I brought my umbrella. How foolish of me.
It's okay. Stopping recording. Rain break. Okay, continue about your sister.
Yes, it's just an interesting fact I've learned. There's something else I haven't actually spoken about yet. So I just thought I'd include that there. Basically, she's married to someone who's been working under the Official Secrets Act for the last 20-30 years, and he's related to Sir John Cockcroft. Just interesting that I'm finding these sort of unusual connections.
Our Cathi Morgan has got a couple of interesting connections, which we knew about already. But tell us more about the Stokes thing and the five and that new knowledge that you have.
Well, Mr. Stokes was quite taken with my research.
Mr. Stokes.
Yes, yes. And he was particularly interested to hear about how Edith Morrison, Lady Morrison, went to the Catholic convent in Rochdale, which was run by German refugee nuns, and he felt that children were taken from there to be used in experiments. You see, Mr. Stokes has actually got a lot of insiders' contacts. He's an insider, he's an ex-intelligence agent, very active in his time, a whistleblower for many, many years. He was imprisoned in Russia for, I think, 2 years before he was exchanged on an exchange program. And when they brought him back, he only weighed 5 stone. He'd been badly treated because he constantly tried to escape. A fascinating character. Yeah,
spirit.
Absolutely. Right. Right to the very end. Very, very lovely, charming gentleman.
So, what did he have to say? What were the main things?
Well, he's published 2 articles that include my research, where he's tied it in with what he was looking at. Yeah.
What primarily
basically, what he's saying is that the people in power are often involved in satanic rituals and the occult, that he has first-hand information on this from witnesses, eyewitnesses, and therefore manipulatable. I mean, we're still talking historically here. Again, his information is again historic. I mean, we're not talking about mind control in this day and age, which is, you know, psychotronic and sophisticated beyond belief. But we're still looking, you know, I'm still talking the roots here.
But these roots involve high-level, top-level governmental control people in all walks of life. Can you explain anything about that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's
Winston Churchill, Jimmy Savile.
Well, of course, Jimmy Savile has been linked very, very firmly with the royal family, and with Prince Philip, Prince Charles, Prince Philip.
Cults.
Well, that's been spoken about by some of his victims, by some of Jimmy Savile's victims have talked literally about ceremonies, people wearing robes and candles. And
is this hearsay or is it fact?
No, that's from one of his victims. Somebody who's been abused by him is talking about the recollections.
Yeah, but this is not your research, so we don't want to deal with this directly. But we want to get to what you have to say about Stokes, what you have to say about your update, and what you
well, in terms of Mr. Stokes, I'd say do check out his articles. He's got a great body of work there on the internet. And
can you give any references?
Yeah, there's a site called truthseeker.info that has a great deal, and he's also on Whale. Is there a site called, is it just Whale? Whale, yeah, it's on that one as well. He's on quite a lot of sites.
And what sort of subject matter are we talking about here?
We're talking about cover-ups and abuse of power in order to manipulate. He also touches on mass brainwashing and MK Ultra. In his latest article, as I say, he's talking about Stephen Ward and MK Ultra. So I would say go and look, because that's his research.
How does that connect and back up your work?
Well, he refers to me and my work in the articles from this year, so you can actually see that.
But from the point of view of this video, what body of your work does he refer to?
He's particularly interested in as I say, the German nuns, the refugees, and that he felt that children were used from that school. And I felt that maybe it was the convent, the Catholic convent in Rochdale, where my grandmother attended. And it seems like she was also involved, because she's the one who had a twins, and one was taken away, and she. I've come to feel that my parents were involved. It wasn't just me and my twin sister, it was my parents and their parents too.
And what kind of involvement? I mean, what kind of things are we dealing with?
I think generally we were just picked up, and these twins were going to be used for some experimentation.
I think
and
we've got another crop circle camera here, so we'll find out we have a look.
This is an interesting crop circle because it looks like a capstone being placed on a pyramid, doesn't it?
Well, do you want to talk about this wonderful crop circle?
I didn't get a great... we can't really see it from here, but it just... the chap at the crop circle centre said it seemed to represent the Illuminati in some way. So, interesting to be here today.
But with your brief look at the formation just beside West Kennet Long Barrow in the background there, well, what does it say to you?
Well, when I briefly glanced at it, as I say, it looked like a capstone being placed on a pyramid, but I didn't get a very close.
Because all the pyramids have got the capstones taken off.
I saw here.
All globally, yeah.
I'm not sure of the significance of that. I'm sure there is one.
So back to the subject in hand.
Yeah, so I did, as I say, identify that I had experienced disassociation frequently throughout my life, and then I identified at this altar that had actually worked, and I feel that I was constantly running away, and I don't think the programming took as well as they'd hoped in my case, but I was brought in and then brought out again perhaps, but I just refused to cooperate. It was basically the thing, and I feel that I created some of my own altars to prevent myself from going into the ones that had been created outside of my own control, and that's how I broke the programming to a large extent.
Could you, to somebody who doesn't understand about what an altar is and how you can break the programming, if you're being programmed by somebody, how do you break it? How does that mechanism work? What thoughts do you do to break it?
Well, it's all about your own gut feelings and intuition, really. I think everyone has to find their own path through it. It's all totally individualistic.
So, for instance, how do you know that you're in the MK Ultra program or whatever mind control program you want to give a name to? But how do you know it's happening to you? How do you start from first base?
Well, to me, first of all, I had an intuition. Secondly, I looked at my background very carefully to see if my intuition, to make sure that intuition, that was something to back it up, because it's not always 100% infallible. So I felt
your intuition.
Then do some research, follow your intuition, and then do some research, try and get some corroboration. And then once you've got, pretty certain, then you can try and identify what the program was, how you were used, and sometimes with that knowledge, and as you look back on your history once more in retrospect, you can then perhaps see how you were being used.
But how do you know you're being used? How does you know about this? You've researched it, you've got your head around it, and you've used your intuition for that.
Initially.
How does an ordinary person get to where you are?
Well, if you've gone through life like I did, I was thinking there's something wrong with me all the time. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. What is it? What is it? And then you hear somebody talking about these kind of experiences, and you go, I think that's what it was. And then you look, this is just me. This is just my little path and my little bit. It's all there to be discovered. I think, unless you have been involved, then you wouldn't have that drive and determination to spend all those many, many, many hours trying to find those answers. I think that in itself is a good sign that you're onto something, and there's truth there.
And how do you follow those steps?
It's all about looking at, I think, because we take it all for granted as we're growing up, but in retrospect we can see anomalies. We can see, well, why did we do this? Why did that happen? Why were my family there? Why was my uncle like? You pick up on the anomalies, and then you can start to put the picture together. And thank goodness we have the internet, and so that if you do decide to do that, then it's there to be discovered.
Well, Cathi, what brings you into this subject? What brings us here?
I'm extremely interested in this entire subject, and I think it's mainly because I've had experiences during my life, and in particular when I was younger, of this nature. Although I don't have a lot of recollection of details, it has been a very strong influence on the outcome of my life, or on the way that my life path has gone. Specifically, when my first conscious memory of this type of thing was before I had any awareness of the UFO phenomena. I was with some friends at a free festival in Wales, in the Rhyadr Valley. There were only about 150 people there. It was quite an isolated place, and somewhere along the line somebody mentioned that a UFO had been seen to have landed in a field adjacent to the festival site. And I remember myself and two friends decided we'd go and try and see if there was anything to be seen, and setting off. And then I just remember suddenly being back at the festival with a kind of in a very sort of startled, stressed kind of frame of mind, but with no recollection of anything having happened. However, I was very much aware of receiving that evening, as the evening wore on. I was becoming more and more aware of what appeared to be a telepathic communication, which filled me with awareness of the connectedness of of each of us to each other, and of the earth and how we were connected to the earth. This was a very, very strong feeling, so much so that I actually was hugging some people around me just out of the pure sort of love energy that I was being filled with. And it was quite some experience. The message was also included something along the lines of mankind is messing up things big time, and nuclear energy was kind of was the kind of subject that the awareness was that it was having repercussions throughout, beyond our own little earth, and so on. Now, what I did with that information at the age of 17 was just, well, basically I was confused for quite some years. However, I've since seen this sort of sentiment, this almost those very words being used by other witnesses who've been giving testimony about abduction experiences. It was in the Starseed Transmissions book, the same, almost word for word, what I'd received. And
what transmissions book?
There's a book called the Starseed Transmissions.
Could you elaborate on that? I haven't heard of it.
I can't even remember who wrote it, but I think it was released possibly around the 80s, in the mid to late 80s, I think. I'm not 100% sure. But again, that's where I first came across the same thing that had been transmitted to me.
How do you spell that?
Starseed, Starsseed. And that's when I really began to link it with, because I never went and looked up UFOs at that point. I just put all that to one side and tried to continue with my life in a kind of traumatized way, if you like. It was fairly traumatic, but it was also very, very, very positive. And the non-materialistic message, I was kind of guided towards all that area of how to live in harmony with the earth, what kind of foods to eat for my body, and because when you eat in a way that's good, very, very good for your body, it's also very, very good for the earth. You see, so that makes things a little bit simpler, really. It's healthy for us, it's healthy for the earth. I was guided towards all that kind of thing, without really knowing why. And it's only subsequently that I've discovered that is a common thread as well. So in sort of later years, I've started to research this topic, abductions. I read a lot about it. Eventually started to read a lot, perhaps again in the late 80s, to read a lot about the subject of UFOs and abductions. And what struck me eventually was how much the military was intertwined with this subject, and ultimately I came upon the subject of mind control. And again, these threads seem to intertwine: the UFO phenomenon and the abduction phenomenon, the MyLab abductions and mind control. So this led me to be driven to research events from my own childhood, so to really try and remember where I came from, if you like, the path that my life had taken, because I've been quite possibly disassociated in a lot of ways, and so I didn't have a continuous awareness of where I came from and what my upbringing was like. As a whole, it was fragmented, and I had to actually make an effort to look back and trace the path of my life, really. It wasn't something that I had conscious aware of until I specifically put my mind to doing this. And this has opened up some very interesting areas of research for me, which I'd like to talk about. Okay, so the first thing that I remembered on this little journey into the past was that I'd had a dream as a child, It wasn't a recurring dream throughout my childhood. It was for a specific period of time, possibly a month or two. It's difficult to say how long, because as a child, time doesn't have the same, you don't have the same concept as you do as an adult, but it went on for quite some time and it affected me quite badly. And I was discussing this dream with someone recently, with James Caspelt actually, when I remembered that I used to say to my parents, "It's not a dream, it's not a dream."
You were discussing this with James Caspel?
Yes, that's when I remembered that it wasn't a dream. I remembered the dream as being that every night when I went to bed, I was terrified. I had to say to my parents, "Close the curtains. I don't want to go to bed. I'm frightened of the moon, and the moon is coming." The dream was that the moon was coming right down to my window and into my window, and there was a woman on the moon looking down at me. And so I remembered this dream, and as I was discussing this with James, I remembered saying to my parents, "It's not a dream, it's not a dream." Of course, and they said, "Of course it is, of course it is." So then that went into my, I forgot about it, and so on. So I brought that back to memory, and I think that's significant.
So when were you discussing this with James Caspel?
That would have been last year. I saw James's, who's now Michael Prince. He's asked to be called Michael Prince now, which was his original name before adoption. I contacted him after seeing his video interviews because I wanted to bring all this close to home, if you like. I wanted to know what happened in the UK in respect of mind control. I'd found out about MK Ultra, which was fascinating, but it was all about America, all over the internet. Yes, you can find out about MK Ultra. There's Bill Clinton apologising for it, and there are the victims getting compensation in Canada from the USA government because the CIA was involved. So on. Yes, fascinating. But I'm thinking, what about the UK? What happened in the UK? I'm trying to make sense of my own life, my own history, and there's James coming out with this extraordinary material which was related to the UK. It was the first stuff I'd seen about the UK, so that's why I contacted him.
So with James, what were the triggers? What was the most important thing you discussed with James? Because this then helps validate James's material as well. And then yours. There's a link there.
The point at which James and I kind of what we had in common was I was looking into the unusual facts about my childhood that as a twin, I'd moved with my twin sister at the age of 4 down to Bath in Somerset, and thinking back over my life, I was thinking about school and so on, and thinking, hold on a minute, there were a lot of twins in my school. It was a Catholic school in the centre of Bath, and there were 3 sets of twins in my class. There were lots of other twins. I remember a boy in my class had twin sisters, and these people they were all from the north of England too, oddly, and so that just rang a little kind of what was that about? Maybe that's something to research. And the headmistress there was a nun called Sister Ignatius Loyola, and again another little now that was the founder of the Jesuit movement, Ignatius Loyola. There's another interesting little snippet there. So I just mentioned this to James, and he said that twins were quite significant in research that's taken place and in experimentation. For some reason, twins are, well, I suppose we know that the Germans and the Nazis used to experiment on twins, so it's probably something along those lines that he was referring to. And really that was it. I spoke to James a couple of times. He was keen to tell me about what was happening in his life at that time. He wasn't so focused on what I was telling him because there's so much was going on for James. And having just experienced at post-traumatic stress myself, I felt that I recognised the symptoms of post-traumatic stress in James.
Such as?
Now here I'm talking about complex post-traumatic stress disorder as opposed to the acute post-traumatic stress that occurs when someone's had a major event, a one-off major event. There's another type of post-traumatic stress that is complex, and that's from ongoing it can be small traumas, ongoing trauma, and specifically to people who can't get away. So if you were a hostage, even if you were well treated, well, if you were a hostage, you would have it because you'd be captive. So it can happen to children very easily because they're captive. And so small traumas on a long-term basis produce similar symptoms to the acute post-traumatic stress, which are they're very wide, and so you don't always get all of them. But they include depression. You become very sensitive to any stress in your environment. Your tolerance for coping with stress becomes very low. There's an overwhelming need to communicate what's happened to you. That's another symptom of it, and part of the healing process is doing that. So that makes a MASH very important to anyone who's traumatised.
This is the whole purpose of this whole thing, and we're very courageous. We thank all of the witnesses for having the courage to come forward. So
it's therapeutic for them to be able to do so, apparently. I've got a lot of information about this subject from an author called Judith Herman, who, if you Google her on the internet, she's written a lot of books, and she's very accessible, very good stuff.
As you are writing material now.
That's right. I'd just like to say that another symptom is disassociation.
What does that mean?
That means you split off part of your personality that's experienced the stress, so you lose memories, and you may lose your groundedness. You can become quite spaced out, possibly quite clumsy. Children can grow up with these symptoms and think that there's something wrong with them, as I did. But then when you find out that, no, it can be a result of trauma applied to you that's caused these changes in your personality. It's quite a revelation, really. It helps your self-esteem. So that I've found that quite an important area. And this is kind of related to what I'm writing about. There's indication that this research, back from psychologists and psychotherapists, that research into trauma is somewhat suppressed by governments.
So how have you found that out? Personal experience?
I found that out. Well, my only personal experience that was trying to obtain a copy of a paper that had been commissioned by our government about domestic violence and post-traumatic stress, and I was unable to get a hard copy of that document. I had to print it off. I was going to use it as evidence myself, and I had to print it off offline because it wasn't available. Now, my research is indicating that is because trauma is a tool of mass control.
A tool of mass control?
Yeah. You see, when trauma is applied to a human being, they have to deal with it by as I say, disassociation, and that can lead to apathy, loss of energy, and a tendency towards addiction, and to be focused on small details of things rather than looking at the big picture. So that makes it perfect for control of the population.
Explain. How does that make it perfect for control?
Because it makes people... they're overwhelmed already, if you like. So when they come in from doing what they have to do, because you also have trouble dealing with practicalities. So they get out, they go to work, they're exhausted, they come in, they plunk themselves down, they sit in front of the telly, and they don't have the energy to get up and do anything or to go and research things, and they don't have the capacity, because they're focused on small things, to look at the bigger picture. They have addictive tendencies. Now, I'm not talking about heroin here. I mean, I'm talking about, you have to have your coffee, and you have to have your sugar, and you have to have your Weetabix, and you don't have the energy to make food for to apply the energy to make your own food. You go and buy the pre-prepared processed food,
which of course gives you more and more problems because of the lack of vitamins and all the chemicals in that.
And you're generating income for the corporations, and also you're possibly going to go and get some Prozac 2 or some other antidepressant medication, which is again generating income for the big pharma.
So where does this get induced? How does this happen to people? Where does this trauma happen?
What did... there was some interesting research into addiction going on big time in the early 1900s. Huge amount. The neurologists and the neuropsychologists where they had these rats in mazes, and they were giving them alcohol, and they were observing their behaviour, and then they were analysing their brain chemistry afterwards. It was a huge topic. Now, somehow they didn't manage to roll out the solutions, because in this day and age, addiction has increased. And when I'm talking about addiction now, I'm also including very low level and habitual behaviour as well as addiction.
Such as?
So
habit forming.
You can say that sugar. You could call sugar an addiction because it does raise your blood sugar level higher than normal, and then it drops below normal, creating a physiological need for the substance. Okay, so that is a true addiction. But it's also used more widely. Since I'm addicted to X Factor, I'm addicted to Coronation Street. I'm talking on that level too, because...
Are those types of programs mind control addiction programs to start with? Is that what their function is? Soap operas?
Well, let's just say they're very convenient for keeping people distracted. It's a huge subject. It's a huge subject about the media, how the role of the media in all this. But one very interesting thing about the role of the media is how Hollywood went big time for the horror movies right in the beginning, when it was first starting out there, the old horror movies, and violence has obviously increased big time too. It's traumatic. We look back on the old horror movies and we laugh because we've desensitized to that now. But when they rolled out those movies, people were traumatized to some extent by. I mean that's the whole thrill of the horror movie. It's a little shot of trauma there, isn't it? In respect of the media, I don't want to say too much. I haven't done too much research myself in that area, but I would recommend somebody who has done quite a lot of research in that area, not only movies, but more specifically music.
In what regard? Because this was used in the Montauk project. They encoded certain signals and numbers into music in certain recording studios, and that was transmitted. And there's also the element of rhythmic beat sequences. Can you expand on that, or
not that in particular? I'm referring to the work of a chap called Dave McGowan, who's researched the music that came out of Laurel Canyon in Hollywood, the beginning of the hippie movement, and its ties with military intelligence. In fact, many of the musicians had parents who were in military intelligence, for example, Frank Zappa, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison of the Doors.
Jim Morrison specifically was in Montauk, related to the Montauk Project.
Right. Well, this is an interesting area where we can see the role of media might have been incredibly significant and deliberate. Anyway, that's...
Anything more than that?
That's a person who's researched that very well, and I'd recommend his work, called Inside the Laurel Canyon. He's a series of 17 articles which are online at Dave's Web.
Can you summarise that briefly?
It's very difficult to summarise because it's a huge subject again, but he didn't come to any big conclusions like so therefore this, but he presents his research for people to make up their own minds about what the reason behind this was. It appears that it was an attempt to create a generation gap.
Which
so
they did,
to take a whole generation away from the stability of previous experiences of the parents and so on, and to turn that generation against their parents.
Which of course happened in the late 60s.
Yes, it did happen. And therefore that generation was ready for control, being controlled.
So that generation is now maturing now. Have you got any further data on that? I mean, it's now sort of our age, so to speak.
No.
So why did you go into that research? What specifically brought you to that research into music?
Right, well...
And you've done film, we just talked about film.
I was looking back into my childhood, and I was looking for any indicators that something about what might have happened to me, the dream I had, and then the experience at the festival I was in. Was there anything else? So I started looking.
Was there any other kind of thing in the festival, like kind of music that was being played? Was there the same kind of stuff?
I remember they were playing "Sympathy to the Devil" over and over again. That's an interesting song.
Which song's that? "Sympathy to the Devil" by...
"Sympathy for the Devil. Please allow me to introduce myself." By the Rolling Stones.
Right.
Anyway,
that connects obviously with the Beatles and that whole era of Control and those kind of music, and why that was so popular.
There's talk of this for sure. It's very interesting. I don't want to make statements about this. I can't verify that. I haven't researched and so on. But yes, one thing that I saw recently that was very interesting was there's a chap that used to that was very influential in the free festival movement in the UK in the 70s, called Sid Roll. And I went to some of those free festivals. I saw Sid Roll. He seemed quite a character, and he was interviewed before he died. He has died now, and one of the things he said was that John Lennon had been in touch with him. He didn't know John Lennon as such, but John Lennon was in touch with him. He knew about this free festival, or something that preceded the free festival movement, going back to the land, living on the land. And he said to Sid, well, I've got an island you can use, an island off the coast of Ireland, if you'd like to take some people and go and use it. And Sid said, John said to me, this is what Sid's saying, John said to me, I need to get away as far away as possible from here, somewhere where they can't get me. But they did get him, didn't they? This is what Sid said. And I thought, they get away from here. So in other words, whatever was happening to him that he was frightened of was happening in the UK, and he went to New York to get away from it.
And therefore whoever
they were,
straight into
got him anyway.
Yes.
And
when was that said? That was 70. Was that 85?
That would have been before then, because my understanding is that Sid Roll conducted that experiment on the island, the experiment in living away from civilization, if you like. That was before the free festivals movement in the 70s. That was before then. This is just something I came across recently on YouTube, but that remark about John Lennon stood out for me. That the fact that he was, because I'm looking at the UK, I'm looking for UK material, and the fact that he that indicated that John Lennon was fleeing something scary in the UK when he went to New York.
What about concentrating on your factors in the UK?
Right, yes, I have come across some interesting things. When I say we were moved to Bath in Somerset, my dad was pretty much a manual worker. He was a maintenance engineer at a factory, and we were living in a council house. And this is when I was born in 1958. In 1962, he was offered a job in Bath, Somerset, as an assistant manager in a firm, maltsters. They dealt with the malts and the barley and so on for beer. And we were given a house in a little village called Swainswick. And when I asked my dad how he got the job, he can't actually remember, so I don't know how he got the job. But the house in Swainswick was in a road called Oriel Gardens. It's a tiny little village, very idyllic, beautiful countryside. Now, Swainswick, much of it is owned by Oriel College, Oxford, hence the Oriel Gardens. And Oriel College was where Cecil Rhodes established his Rhodes Scholarships. That's an interesting fact. Okay. Behind my house, where we used to wander, I lived there from the age of 4 to the age of 11, and where we used to play was Salisbury Hill, Solsbury, Salisbury Hill, of the song by Peter Gabriel, Salisbury Hill. That's the Salisbury Hill that he was singing about, and that song seems to be describing an abduction experience.
Is that military abduction experience for mind control, or alien abduction experience?
Alien abduction experience. If you listen to the lyrics of that song, it seems to be. That's what it's.
So that implies that Gabriel's been abducted.
Well, who knows? But that is, when I heard that song, my kind of goosebumps came up, because it was telling my story in a sense of my experience at the festival. It just resonated with me. Now Gabriel used to live in Swainswick. Peter Gabriel lived in Swainswick later in his life.
So what other things happened there?
My dad had an accident at work and lost some fingers on his hand, so he was taken to a particular hospital. So in the course of my research, I wanted to find out, what about this hospital? Did anything happen there? And a lot happened there. The hospital was Frenchay Hospital in Bristol, and I discovered that it was in the grounds of that hospital that the Burden Neurological Institute was established in 1939 by a chap called Golla, Golla. I think he's a Czechoslovakian, and some very, very famous and significant research went on there by a chap called William Gray Walter, who discovered brainwaves, identified brainwaves, the alpha, beta, theta brainwaves. This was, very early days. Now, it was neurological research, but William Walter Gray was basically starting off cybernetics.
Cybernetics?
Yeah, he was making little robots. He'd been very interested in Pavlovian conditioned responses, and he was developing these little, they were tortoise-shaped robots, because it wasn't about the form of the robot, it was about what it was able to do, that would respond in the way that humans responded under Pavlovian behavioralism. The robots were responding in the same way, or that's what he was looking at. Now, the research was quite advanced. In 1962, they actually broadcast brain waves from Bristol to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and back.
What are the
by the relay satellite?
Why are they transmitting brainwave activity up into space via a relay and back again?
I don't know. It's a very interesting little fact there, because when you see today that they have now mapped the brain and that thoughts can be used by disabled people to use computers, or by the military to shoot people. They can sort of think about this target getting hit and it gets hit and so on. That it's almost presented as if this was new research, but it's been going on a long time. He'd already mapped the much of this thoughts. He had people there he could hook people up, and they could remotely turn a TV set on and off. This is in the early 60s at the Burden Neurological Institute.
So we're talking cybernetic control, cyborg control mechanism.
We're talking research
going back
into
to
that.
Before the war. The initial research was designed before the war.
Yes.
So the fact that the institute was built before the war means that whatever led it to being built must have already been given reason to be researched during the 1930s.
There's much evidence of Rockefeller funding. He was working alongside a Rockefeller fellow, and I think there was funding there. That there's clear evidence of association there, and also that this isn't secret research. This is all the documentation's out there in articles and journals on the internet. The RAF, or the equivalent of the RAF in those days, approached him then. And
the RAE?
Yes, it said RAE. Perhaps it was the Admiralty, actually. But it was for pilots. They wanted this research, the research that turned the telly on by remotely. I think they might have been wired up, but it was using brain impulses or, electric. That's what they wanted for their pilots. So that was incorporated into these jet planes.
But you're talking 1940s here.
They approached him, from the evidence that I've seen, is they approached him about this research in 1962, in the early 60s, possibly earlier, but that's just what
the research must have been ongoing in the late 50s to be materialising as usable material in the early 60s.
Yeah, so interesting stuff.
So how does this relate to your experiences and your particular reason why you went to that research?
Well, in all this sort of research, I talked to my parents and I said, I'm just researching, mind control. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm talking to my parents about this, what they're going to say, kind of thing, because they're quite straight and so on. And I was saying, I wondered if anything might have happened to us as a family. And I was amazed when they said, oh, well, yeah, it might have done.
So your parents acknowledged this?
They just said it might have done.
And what did they say happened to them? Your father went into hospital with a finger problem. What happened with him?
They don't have any recollection of anything happening. But my mum followed me out to the kitchen and said, be careful who you're talking to. We don't want you disappearing. And I'm like, what is happening?
At what age were you when this happened?
This was recently. Last year. This is the first time I've ever broached the subject with my parents, and that's what they said.
So, for instance, if you were to disappear, what would you want to be said right now that you would want to get out?
Okay, well, we'll just carry on with this. I'll just tell you everything I've come across, really. Now, my mum said, I said, Mum, is there anything you can remember, anything at all unusual? And she said, I remember that my mum, that's my grandma, kept talking about Lady Moran. And I'm like, oh, right, okay. So I'm thinking, I didn't get much out of that sort of little interview, apart from the acknowledgement, which was great. So then I goes and puts Lady Moran into Google, and boom, there's the whole of UK mind control opened up for me, or at least the starting points of researching this material. Very amazing.
So what exactly has Lady Moran got to do with all this stuff then?
Well, I found out that Lord Moran was Churchill's doctor, known famously as Churchill's doctor, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Courage, which basically was examining the fact that soldiers in the First World War weren't aggressive enough and how that could be addressed.
Yeah, there was a big problem in the war because a lot of soldiers were shooting their guns but not killing anybody else.
Not aiming at anyone, but he reckoned...
Because they didn't want to kill the other people.
That's right.
Fundamentally, but they wanted to be seen to be...
That's right, that's absolutely right. He reckoned it was less than 30% actually aimed to kill.
Yeah, and this was adopted by the US military, and that's why they've...
Well, yes. So Lordy Moran goes, is looking at this area, and I find out that there was a chap in England who was doing similar research to that of Ewan McCameron. Now we know Ewan McCameron was intimately tied up with MK Ultra. But there was also...
What was his tie-up with MK Ultra?
He was the doctor, he was Dr. Green, I think. He was the doctor who was performing...
Which Asbolt and Barry King refer to as Dr. Green.
Oh, do they?
Yes.
Right. Well, there was a Dr. White and a Dr. Green, there were colours. He was one of those. I don't know which one. I haven't looked that much into MK Ultra, just enough to spark off this interest. But he was putting patients to sleep for long periods of time. He was wiping their memories using electric shock treatment, possibly giving them LSD, but replacing their memory, experimenting with replacing their memories, or wiping their memories completely in a kind of Mancurian candidate type of research. And it only turned out that some of this research was being funded by the CIA. This is the whole thing about MK Ultra. All the documentation had been destroyed, but somebody found the accounts which detailed the experiments to some extent and validated the victims' claim compensation which they received. Bill Clinton apologised on camera for the MK Ultra experiments, and there you go. The evidence was finally, and it could no longer be denied. The poor people who experienced this were being told that they were crazy.
So tying this back into Europe.
So Cameron had a colleague in London who also had a sleep room, who also was keeping patients asleep. He was called William Sargent. He had a sleep room. He was giving patients, again, inappropriately, in my opinion, because some of these patients were coming in with small complaints like postnatal depression and such, and they were being put to sleep, having them given massive doses of ECT, way above the normal.
Yes, this happened to one of our colleagues, Brenda, and that's on basis 10, basis 120
Right.
This happened with her last year. She was absolutely, she was fortunate to get out alive.
Right.
This is in a London hospital only in the last 18 months.
I actually saw that. Interesting, yes. He was wiping their memories, and he was corresponding with Cameron about how long somebody could be kept asleep for. And this was in 1948 that he opened a sleep room in London, St Thomas's. Okay, now the association with Lord Moran was Sargent's tutor. He was his mentor. And Sargent wasn't originally looking at being a psychiatrist. He was his initial dissertation was on pernicious anemia, and it wasn't well received, so he became despondent, and Lord Moran said, he gave him a lot of support and said, why don't you become a psychiatrist? So there's a connection with Lord Moran. Another connection with Lord Moran is that Sargent, McCameron, Ewan McCameron, John Rees from the Tavistock Institute, and Lord Moran all visited, they all accompanied Rudolf Hess to Nuremberg to his trial. Now Hess was complaining about being hypnotised, and people said he was crazy, but looking at the research that was being done at that time with mind manipulation, maybe that needs revisiting and looking at again.
And thus no one was ever allowed to talk to Hess.
I don't know much about it, but that just seemed a very important fact to me, and it seemed to tie all these areas together.
But we're now linking again, we're doing another link with the German mind research. And this is during the war, therefore there was a link.
Oh, just after. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
just
after,
after.
wasn't it? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So these are just areas. These are areas that I'm beginning to research. This is my starting point for research. So this is what I want to say to people, because if I do disappear, then you'll know I was onto something.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, is there any other things that you will want to get across then? And yeah, you're talking about Lord Moran and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, yes. I would like to point to anyone interested in this stuff. There's an excellent Radio 4 broadcast that's on the internet now. It was broadcast a couple of years ago, and it's called Revealing the Mindbender General, and it's by a chap called John Moore, M-A-W, and it's about a half hour. Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
The Mindbender General, and who is the Mindbender General?
The Mindbender General is the general hospital where he was working. So the Mindbender General, as in the general hospital, Mindbender. Okay. In respect of how Lady Moran might have been connected to my family, I haven't found out very much. Which is so frustrating that my mum can't remember. I'm hoping that she'll come up with something, but it doesn't. No, she doesn't seem to be able to. But however, what I have found out is that Lady Moran, who was called Dorothy Dufton, was from Bramley in Yorkshire, and she was at Leeds University at the time when my grandfather, my mum's dad, would have been living in Leeds also, but he would have only been about 18 at the time. Perhaps that must have been about 19... I don't know. It was just after the First World War, because she was researching the effect of mustard gas on the troops. That was her research when she met Lord Moran. Now, after meeting him, he wasn't Lord Moran then, he was Charles Wilson. And after meeting him, she somehow, I don't know how, but in some sort of who's who about Lord Moran, it was written that he so kindly and patiently tended her while she was in a coma for a year. And then after this, they married. Just another interesting fact.
How did she get to be in a coma?
I don't know. It didn't say that. It was just a little biography by somebody about this chap, and this is what occurred.
Yeah.
So the only connection I can see is there might have been some connection there with the family, with my grandfather being in the same city. So again, research, and that was Sargent's big area, researching the effect, the traumatised troops. He came up with...
But this was a big thing, because shell shock was...
That's what he was researching. The troops would come into Bristol, into the hospital at Bristol, and he was involved. Now, I'm not sure where he was working with the troops. I mean, there were massives of troops coming back shell-shocked, and they were being dealt with, and he came up with... that's what he was researching, ostensibly, how to cure them.
So bringing us up closer to what happened with yourself, and you're going... This is a healing process that you're going through. By doing this research, you can understand it. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's the therapeutic effect of sharing your story and your information and being heard and supported and listened to. But for me, I need the details. I need to be very grounded in this. I need to do the research. I need to research it meticulously so that then I can feel grounded and not so... My story of my life is being spaced out, being a dreamer, wandering around chaotically from place to place and so on, and I'm trying to...
So what exactly brought what is the history of your experiences, if you can bear to mention now? What brings you to this area? You had the abduction or whatever that happened at the festival.
Well, I'd like to look into that more, because there's possibly with a regression to
Do you
see
trust
what
regression?
did happen.
And who would do that?
I would for a specific reason. I think if I was very focused on what the specific thing I wanted to remember, with somebody who had a good reputation for not leading subjects and so on, I would be very interested in seeing what I could dig out there. I've never had anything like that. That's a possibility for my own personal.
What exactly is the main thing which brought you to think that you had some kind of strange experience that led you to do the research?
I had a recent clear episode. What should we call it? An episode. I had a bad experience, a traumatic experience, and I actually suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. I was in a violent relationship, and after it was over, it was an 18-month relationship, but I was kind of captive because I was living in a foreign country with this person. Nobody else spoke English. He had control of our money. He became abusive, and it's common. This is Judith Herman's research led me to understand that 90% of complex post-traumatic stress victims are women who've been in domestic relationships that are abusive. So I found out that was probably the cause of my depression, probably the cause of my sleeplessness and all the symptoms that came along with it, which is why I felt when I heard some of the witnesses describe their personalities, or when I saw James Caspel, it seemed to me this is I can see, it seems to me that they have these symptoms too, this symptom of trauma, which might be jumping from subject to subject, not being focused, telling the story, having to get the story out very, very, quickly. The words are tumbling out after each other, and almost a compulsion to tell the story.
And do you recall any kind of military involvement with this? I mean, with your previous past, with your family? Why?
Well, again, this is just the beginning of my research. The area that we lived, the little cul-de-sac called Oriel Gardens, there were, I think, 8 houses, and most of the families living in those 8 houses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I think there were 10 actually, had a military background. I asked my father about the people who lived there. This is how I found out that they were, he said mainly Admiralty, the people living in that cul-de-sac. So another area of research is how the heck did we end up there then? What were we doing there? Who knows? I mean, I was one of the children who was monitored throughout my life as a part of the National Child Development Survey, which was a survey.
Is that because of the twins?
No, this is because I was born in a particular week in the year of 1958. Everyone born between, I think it was the 3rd and the 10th of March, was kind of signed up to this survey and monitored from time to time throughout their lives. So maybe, who knows, maybe we were picked up on that.
Was it a blood thing, a blood group importance there? Or?
Well, this group has been called upon from time to time to give further information, and I think it was 2003 or around that time we were all visited, and blood was taken and DNA was taken, and there's now research using that material.
There's a new thing that's going on to get 500,000 people in the UK called the Biobank. That's an active programme which is active. That was in the last year, maybe 2 years. They're calling it the Biobank. It's got various backing. They're taking DNA samples, psychometric tests, all that sort of stuff. And I'm in that. I volunteered for that, but I wanted to see what was going on inside.
Oh, really?
I mentioned Area 51 a lot, and seemed to stimulate a few ears, but maybe purely from a science fiction, they've seen the movie type thing.
I think what's important is to, throwing out a few facts here and there isn't always that helpful. If all this research can be pulled together and focused, I think that's the important thing, and backed up at every point with references. That would be really useful, and that's what I see myself as being very much drawn to do. So
you've written an article. Let's talk. You've started to write an article and published a history of mind control in the UK. Can you summarise or briefly introduce that?
Well, yes, I have. What it is going to become an article. But it was the letter that I initially wrote to Miles to introduce myself and ask if he had any information about the subjects, and the contents of the letter were basically what I've just talked about, everything that I've just talked about on camera here. I might have missed a few things out. In terms of my own ET experience. There was an incident where I was living in London, and it was probably in 1979, and at this point I was so spaced out, I was unfocused, I was kind of suffering, I was kind of depressed, I didn't know why, I thought there was something wrong with me, and it's only later I identified that these are symptoms of the PTSD. But at that time, I just got a paintbrush for some reason. I drew this picture on the wall, and of course it was like a grey, big eyes and a small nose and a small mouth and a kind of collar, and I didn't know why I drew it. It just seemed
round
like
eyes.
I don't do much painting.
Did it have round eyes?
Big almond-shaped eyes.
His cloak. You mentioned something about
the collar, kind of a high collar, as if it was a cloak. And a few months or weeks later, I saw a very similar picture in a newspaper, and it said, if this picture means anything to you, ring this telephone number. And I was so kind of looking for help.
Whitney Strieber. Oh, give us
right.
a quick.
So then again, looking back, I'm seeing pieces that again point to possible ET involvement there, because I don't want to say go on wild kind of statements about it, because I'm just sticking to the facts here. I think I have to stay grounded with this. But again, a connection there. He was the first. As I said, it came to the 80s, and I did start researching UFOs and finding out about these things. But he was the first researcher who pointed out that these abductions might be something other than nuts and bolts physical. That there was some other sort of dimensional aspect to these abductions, where somebody might be taken on an abduction, but their body remains. Say, I think the example again was on a train. He gave. Where somebody was abducted astrally and then put back into their body and so on. He introduced that concept for me anyway. That was the first indication I
But was it ET? Was it ET that you saw on the front page of the? Yes,
it was a grey. Yes, a classic.
But it was the same image, exactly the same image.
It wasn't exactly the same. But it was enough similarity for me to go and phone that phone number, which was something outside of my normal kind of behaviour, if you like. It wasn't something I didn't normally go off phoning phone numbers out of I mean, I had to go to a phone box to do it. For example, it wasn't convenient. It wasn't something. I was quite poor. I didn't buy books. That's the story of my life. I've always been poor. And again, I think that's the post-traumatic stress has inhibited my potential of becoming a part of society and being successful. Now I think it's probably a good thing, but I have learnt to adapt to poverty, and it's been extremely useful. I've learnt to live a very good quality of life without material.
So was that an ET experience, or was it a military abduction?
No, that remains to be seen, because I, for most of my life, after researching ET material, I wasn't aware of military abductions until more recently, when I started to look into this mind control area.
So do you think you were?
Now I think there's a potential that now, let's say that my ET experience was positive. It's had a positive experience on my life. It's made me value things that aren't material. It's value organic food and being healthy and so on. So, and that's good for the earth and so on. Yes, okay. But now that I'm reading about the military involvement with abductions and ETs, I have to ask the question: Could the episode at the festival have been a military abduction?
Did you see the craft at that?
No, I didn't see anything. I've never seen anything. It was telepathic, but it was very, very powerful telepathic communication, which I didn't even associate with ET material until I read that the same people who had clear UFO experience were coming out with this almost word for word the same sort of message.
A lot of that's connecting with Dave Marrow.
Oh yes, in what sense?
The traumatics.
Oh
experience.
Yes, I did feel when I watched his video that he was experiencing post-traumatic stress. Yeah, I mean, just to go kind of brainstorm here a little bit, I'm feeling that this whole thing is much bigger than you would first think.
And the implications are very serious here.
Yes, yeah, it's opened up this research, as I see it, the little starting points, and it's opened up a whole vista of areas for research and for pulling all this stuff together: the mind control, the milos, the UFO, the British, and psychiatry, for example. Psychiatry was born out of this research into cybernetics and the physiology of the brain and the brain chemistry. From thence came the psychiatrists who applied sort of chemicals to the problems, if you like. They really felt, and electricity, and that was the biggie, wasn't it? That was psychiatry. It was the electric shock treatment.
Did you refer to something in the 1890s or something?
Yes, they were already using electricity on privileged and upper class wealthy people. Were being electricity was being used to try and treat depression, but obviously that was rolled out later for the sort of lower classes. But that's from when psychiatry was born. It was all experimentation, and I don't believe it was in the interests of the individual patients.
What do you believe it is in? In summary, what ultimately do you think this is going, and where's it come from, and where's it going?
I think well-meaning researchers have been researching their individual little areas in the hope of improving humanity, and that knowledge and research has been appropriated and applied to control the population.
By whom? Do you think we're dealing with a human control?
The inhumanity of that concept leads me to say, no, it isn't human, or not human as we understand it. People with humane consideration, compassion, no. And it's unintelligent in a human sense as well. It doesn't have the intelligence of understanding that humans do very well the closer they stay in touch with nature, and the less artificiality there is in their environments, the better that they do, and the more cooperation and less potential for control. But that's not that's not where things have gone. We've gone completely away from that. The artificial intelligence, the robotics, the way that we've become industrialized. That wasn't in the industrialization was not in the interest of the individual by any means. That was done for possibly material wealth, power, control. It was not done. The individual doctors and scientists and researchers more often than not thought that they were trying to improve the lot of the human individual, but their research was not used with that as the main intent.
So you're looking at a cyborg non-human society then that's going to evolve, or non-human? What's your pitch on what you've researched? Where it
But I think in a sense
to?
it goes back to the message that was imparted to me, that we need to value nature. We need to have as little artificiality in our food and our environments as possible. I mean,
but with Codex Alimentarius and all these kinds of things, we are losing everything.
Yeah, that's the complete opposite. That's where they're trying to take us, whoever they are, whoever's implementing this Codex Alimentarius. I don't know who's behind all that, but it is not. Again, it is not in the interests of the individual. It's again another tool for control and power, which is not healthy for the planet or people.
What would you suggest other abductees or people who are watching this, what ultimately would you want to say to them that would help them?
No matter how crazy you might feel, that your story is, it's not to us, and we're here to listen and to try and help you make sense of it, and to try and help us make sense of what's going on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add that I found out that there's a tiny ancient church in Swanswick, and Bath itself is it's been described as a deeply Masonic city, and the architect of Bath is buried in the little church ground in Swanswick, so there seems to be some significance there of the importance of that village.
Swanswick, is that near Bath?
Yes, it's just a few miles outside Bath. It is part of the Bath district. Just as, actually, Miles, I'd just like to say, as we are in a crop circle, I did a couple of interviews myself not so long ago this year, and they're on YouTube on my site, which is Cathi Morgan. And on the second one, I described a very unusual experience in a lot more detail, what I consider to be a contactee experience. So I could point people to that. But the other thing is the crop circle thing. On my website, I'd published an article about how I met up with a couple of abductees myself in the 80s, in the late 80s, and ultimately that led to me being present when an anonymous letter was sent to Colin Andrews about the Cheesefoot Head crop circle in 1989, which he has published on his website. He's got an anonymous letter from Rochdale, and I was actually at a UFO meeting with a couple of people, one of them being an abductee herself, when that letter was put into the envelope, which I thought was extraordinary, because there's quite an interesting story behind that.
Such as?
Well, the letter predicted a crop circle precisely, and Colin Andrews was quite taken with it. As I say, he's published it on his website, and he was wondering where the source of this letter was, because he was investigating crop circles. The letter predicted a crop circle, so he wanted to know about this letter, and perhaps that would give him a clue as to how these crop circles were being made. But so I wrote to him with all the details that I knew, because this person I knew who was an abductee had got hold of this poem. It was something like "Ring of Roses, the crop falls down," and it went on with some predictions. And you could really, if you do read my article, and you can also get links on there to Colin Andrews' account of it, you'll get the whole story. It's quite complex, but as I say,
basically, are you saying that you predicted a crop circle?
No, I was just at the meeting when this channel of letters was brought to this meeting by somebody, a close friend of mine who was an early abductee herself.
What was her basic synopsis, or what's her basic story as an abductee?
She, when I got to know her, I said I was interested in UFOs. Well, she saw a book in my house, and she said she'd seen one. And I begged her to tell me. She wasn't going to tell me, but on the second or third meeting, she explained that she'd read the same book, The Pen and UFO Mystery, and contacted the authors, who was Jenny Randalls, to say that she'd seen a UFO, and they'd tried to get her to go under hypnotic regression. And initially, she refused. But they kind of tricked her into it by sending her a solicitor's letter and asking her to phone. And when she did, it was a solicitor called Harry Harris, who was a crop circle investigator, and he said, "Oh, please," they begged her, and in the end she agreed to go under hypnosis. And it turned out that she'd had a classic UFO abduction with greys and probes, and many of the features we see. And as it happens, Colin Andrews is also close to Harry Harris. So
okay, well, the rain comes back and we're going to have to cut for that.
I think that'll be it then too, Miles.